So today I'd like to walk you through my reading of the chapter that you were to have read, Coping with Stress, the Superhero Way. I am in the ebook available from the library, and I'm going to try to close this window here to make it bigger. There we go. And I'd like to just really focus on my initial reading. I was looking, as you did, for the arguments, the reasoning, the evidence, any claims that are made, as well as the persuasive appeals of ethos, pathos, and logos. I'm only going to highlight some of that. I won't walk through the entire document, but this hopefully will give you a good understanding of how you can begin to think critically about a piece. So let's start with just some observations, and then we'll move into more of the critique of it. So I like to begin any piece with identifying the claim, or what might be termed the thesis statement in more traditional writing. And sometimes it's at the very beginning. This part right here that you see on the screen, that's actually an introduction by the author of the book, or the compiler or editor of the book. This is where we actually begin to see the author's writing Deleuze's actual article. So we look for a claim usually somewhere at the beginning, although that's not always the case. Sometimes authors will hold off to the end to make their claim as a way of sort of leading the audience to their understanding. But in this piece, it follows a fairly traditional format. You have sort of an introduction. We live in stressful times. So that's an attention grabber that we can all relate to. And then the claim is near the end of this first page of the article. It's right here. We can still learn to cope like a superhero and ultimately save ourselves. By the way, I just highlighted that because I am signed in to ProQuest, and you can use the highlighting and notation tool if you desire to annotate. So this is the claim. This is the big picture. What is the entire argument? The argument is superheroes can help us better understand how to cope with the stressors in life. So the entire piece then points back to that particular claim or thesis. The next thing you were asked to do was to identify the reasons that are presented. So if the claim is we can use superheroes to help us cope, then what's the reasons for that? What statements validate that particular claim? So the first reason that I was able to discern was, and it's actually not a reason to support it, but a reason to explain that it's important, and that is stress can be difficult to define. Oftentimes reasons will present themselves as the first sentence in a paragraph. It's what's known as a topic sentence. In this case, it's very easy to see stress can be difficult to define, and the rest of the paragraph goes on to explain how some stress is good, some stress is bad. Sometimes I react in a way that you may not feel is a positive thing, but on the other hand, I think it's great. And so that's what the author is trying to claim, that stress means different things to different people. But I do want to show you where there are some other reasons that are maybe not as easy to find. It's not just the first sentence of the paragraph. So if I look to the next page, Coping with Stress, and this author, by the way, does a great job of helping us with the subtitles, the headings. That kind of gives us a big clue that there's another main point coming up. In this case, if I looked at the first sentence and even the second sentence, it's not really a claim. It's more like the author is speaking directly to us, talking about how we may be feeling. But in actuality, the reason doesn't come until here. And that is, it does help to have certain global personality traits that have been found to help with resiliency. So that's where the claim is. If we look at the rest of this paragraph, then it talks about dispositional optimism and locus of control. Those are then the evidence or the support for that particular reason, and that is how we're built internally can have some impact on how we deal with stress. So there's actually quite a few reasons throughout. The three main reasons talk about the problem focused coping, and then After that, we have emotion-focused coping, and then actually proactive coping. So those also would be 3 big reasons. And then within each of those reasons are evidence that's provided to sort of back up that particular stance. So I'd like to get into that evidence just a bit. If I look at page 192, this is where it's talking about the emotion-focused coping. And the reason, if you're curious, is right here. These strategies, as the name implies, the name emotion-focused coping, help us to regulate the emotional responses to the stress of life events. So that's the reason. And then I thought that this next paragraph did a really good job of providing evidence to support that. So it talks about here Spider-Man being, or Peter Parker could have been very freaked out by becoming Spider-Man, but actually he ends up using it for the good. Then it talks about how you can dig into your work, exercise, or engage in a hobby. Again, concrete example or evidence to support the claim that our emotions are tied to the stress that we might be experiencing. And then even down here he gets into some villains, Eddie Brock and Harry Osborn. So there's different types of evidence presented in this particular piece. A lot of the times, as you know, the writer focuses in on the superhero aspects and then tries to connect it back to our own experiences as humans. So that evidence then can present itself in a variety of ways. Remember, the ultimate goal of the writer is to help us use superhero characteristics to improve our coping skills. And the way that she's going to try to persuade us to do that is through ethos, pathos, and logos. So for ethos, I'm just going to show you one element of each. Sorry, I scrolled up too much here. So the first one is ethos. Ethos is an appeal based on the writer's character, or the characteristics, the credentials of a particular author. So I did notice here that the fact that she is a PhD, has a PhD, is included. And also, if I look at the end of this document, there is an author's information page. And it says that she is a psychologist, research author, and teacher. So this seems to qualify her as having the credentials needed to discuss stress, which is a psychological state. And so that has built her ethos just by the author's information. Next, we will look at pathos. Now, pathos is a emotional appeal, or an appeal based on feelings. Those feelings can be positive or negative. They can be strong, or they can be complex. And this particular piece actually frequently uses pathos, emotional appeal, when it talks about, defeating the villain and winning and overcoming. Those are all emotional responses to the piece. And so I just wanted to show you one here that really kind of stood out to me. And that is with the use of these very expressive words, bam, pow, bonk. So these actions aren't always in your face. Bam, pow, bonk variety, like Batman used to beat a person or a problem into submission. We might have a gentler touch. So those are really action words, right? That make us have a reaction to the situation. In this case, we are emotionally responding through those words, or at least that's the goal of the writer, to get us to emotionally respond. Finally, we want to look at logos, which is an appeal to logic. And although this writer did not use very many facts or statistics, she did actually point out at one point on page 195 the fact that the logical reasoning behind this statement. So down here she says logic would dictate that too many roles or too many that we perceive as negative, over demanding, or unrewarding could cause role overload. So she acknowledges the logic behind some of her reasons. As far as her voice goes, a lot of times it was conversational. You'll notice she uses we a lot. This is a very inclusive pronoun, and that makes us hopefully connect to her writing a little bit more. And she also does a good job of acknowledging at times the opposition or any potential counter arguments. So, for example, here she says, superheroes, it's true, may not have the same range of roles that we do, as their primary role is often so all-encompassing. So she does acknowledge what the opposition may be thinking. So that sort of lends well not only to her voice but also to her ethos, because it shows that she's thinking critically through the issue at hand. So my overall understanding of this piece then leads me to draw conclusions about its effectiveness. Now I'm bringing to it my own personality, my own experiences, my own understanding of stress as well as superheroes, and all audience members will do that in their own way. So first of all, I wanted to comment on the fact that I loved the connections that the author made to the superheroes. For example, on page 194, I really liked down here where it says, we can think of these as we develop our own spidey sense, or the Gadgeteer's tool belt. So again, just making that really concrete connection between superhero life and our own life. I really appreciated those connections, and I felt like that was really can be motivating for an audience, particularly those who are keen towards superheroes. And as I have a 5-year-old son, superheroes are prevalent in our home, and so that sort of connection really spoke to me. However, I also felt at times that the focus on superheroes kind of deviated from its original force. For example, on page 195, she talks about a Wookiee. Well, that's from Star Wars, and I don't really associate Star Wars at the same level of superheroes as DC Comics or Marvel, and so I was having a hard time with those mixed metaphors. Later she talks about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Again, not really on the same level as those types of superheroes such as Superman or Batman, and so I felt like there was a disconnect in those metaphors or analogies. Sometimes she had really good examples to support her reasons, such as on page 194. Sorry, I'm trying to find it here. She says you can start networking or sending out resumes. Very concrete example. I thought that was really great. But at other times, it's more weak, and I was really kind of hoping for more specific examples, because sometimes when you talk in analogies, it gets a little confusing and sort of out there and hard to place into real life. So on page 191, around this area here, I really just wanted her to explain, okay, so it gives us the time, it permits it allows us to wait for the right time to bring something up, but what does that really look like in terms of real life? Give us another concrete example. That's what I was hoping for at that point. So that kind of sums up my reading of this piece. I hope that me talking through it helped you better sort of tune your reading or your critical eye to this piece. It's not that the piece is complex necessarily. However, it does pack in a lot of different strategies in order to really connect with the audience. So keep this in mind as we continue in this discovery of critical thinking and analyzing writing. The same things that you're going to analyze in these pieces, ultimately you should be then applying to your own writing.